Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 340. This week the questions are taken from guide 413 on the Spanish ship Destructor and the Wednesday video on the British Pacific Fleet, the first one in that ongoing series. And so over to the questions. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, why did Destructor not immediately spawn a response? I'd imagine the Spanish didn't, for obvious reasons, since they didn't have any money to build more, but what about the British and everybody else? Partly because there was just the one of her, but a larger part of it actually comes down to the whole argument about whether or not she does represent the very first destroyer or a slightly high-end torpedo gunboat, because there were torpedo gunboats being built both before and after her with a similar kind of role to what the ones she was supposed to serve, and one or two of them were even slightly faster than she was, although admittedly the ones that were a bit faster tended to be some of the more capable torpedo boats that were retroactively designated as torpedo gunboats because of their size and armament, more so than their speed. But you've also got to remember that her speed advantage, while higher than the average torpedo gunboat, you're only talking about maybe 2 to 3 knots faster than the faster end of the average torpedo gunboat type. And torpedo boats of the time were generally either of about the same speed as a torpedo gunboat or maybe a fraction faster, not quite as fast as Destructor normally. So although she was quite quick for her time, it wasn't a massive speed advantage the way that you would see full-blown destroyers later on having over cruisers and absolutely definitely battleships. And tonnage-wise and armament-wise, Destructor sits in a kind of slightly weird middle position in that she is, as we said, faster than most torpedo gunboats and as fast as or faster than most torpedo boats, but she's also slightly more heavily armed than the average torpedo boat, but for a torpedo gunboat, she's relatively underarmed as a function of her size. And it seems that, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, a lot of the bigger navies, while still building torpedo gunboats, tended to seem to prefer to have more and bigger guns and drop 2-3 knots of speed on their craft, which also therefore being bigger would be able to go further, as opposed to going for this slightly smaller, although still fairly seaworthy design, which had less firepower for dealing with individual torpedo boats, because obviously torpedo boats were also getting somewhat bigger and somewhat more heavily armed. So 5-10 years down the line, there were actual torpedo boats which were verging at that point on being torpedo boat destroyers, which outgunned Destructor, whereas the torpedo gunboats that had been built in that period still held a fairly significant firepower advantage, even if their speed was beginning to drop off quite significantly by the mid-1890s. And that kind of halfway house status that Destructor sits in between the torpedo boat and the torpedo gunboat, and theoretically possibly also the torpedo boat destroyer, is pretty much why no one copied her, at least initially. Kevin Langmuir asks, given the advances in material science since the last battleships were built, how much more protected would a battleship be these days if it was built with modern materials? If we were structurally building it similar to World War II era ships and counting modern missile defense systems and so forth, would materials like ceramics and Kevlar, etc., have a dramatic effect, or would it be a case of a massive increase in cost for a minuscule benefit? I mean, we'd almost certainly have to rebuild forges capable of actually manufacturing steel plates of this size and treatment, but assuming that we did that, we could make better ship armor than was around in World War II. But I think you'd be looking at potentially following one of two different pathways. You could either follow the pathway of making ship armor in pretty much the same way that they made ship armor back then, except using modern steel blends. And for that, for a relatively minimal increase in price, you would get some increase in protection, because nowadays, compared to the face hardening on World War II era armor, we do have some of the slightly more exotic, especially hard steel blends, and we also have some less rigid blends, some more flexible ones which could be done on the back. Now, casting up the steel so that you could have one mix on one side and one mix on the other, and having it intermix and then face hardening it, would be a bit more difficult and complex than just taking a single homogeneous piece of steel and then differentially cooling it. But with modern tech, it certainly could be done, and therefore working on that basis of incredibly hard resistive face and softer backing plate, we could make something that was a bit better. And of course, we have the comparisons of British, German, Japanese, French, American, etc., armor plates, so we can also work out what the optimal depth of hardening and so forth actually is. So combining all of that, from a small to modest increase in price, we could get armor plate that would have a better performance than the old stuff, although we'd be talking about maybe double-digit % improvement, not double or more. The other route that we could go down would be to basically abandon that concept entirely and try and make battleship armor out of the same kind of stuff that they armor modern tanks with. Now, there is a little bit of a difficulty here, because obviously, one, there's a huge amount more expense involved, but you see tank armor these days, at least as far as the unclassified stuff it goes, being talked about in steel equivalent. So, this much Cobham, Dorchester, or the new Epsom armor that's going on Challenger 3. They say, well, this is equivalent to so many inches or millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. Now, the problem with that comparison is that, of course, rolled homogeneous armor by its nature is homogeneous, i.e. what in US terms would be called Class B armor, not the face-hardened armor that you'd find on the sides of battleships. And it's the softer kind. It's less resistive than the face-hardened armor. So, if someone says, oh yeah, well, we can put a foot, so 12 inches of modern tank armor on, and that's the equivalent of, let's say, arbitrarily 4 feet of rolled homogeneous steel, therefore that's the equivalent of 4 feet of battleship armor. That's not how it works. The battleship armor would be better than RHA, at least when it comes to dealing with battleship shells. And that's the other problem with directly trying to use modern composites as used on tanks, because those are designed primarily to deal with hate rounds, Hesh rounds, and long rod really dense penetrators, not so much armor piercing capped ballistic shells, although some of the early composites obviously did have to account for potentially dealing with them. So they are more optimized towards a threat profile that a battleship probably isn't going to face. And on top of that, you also have to factor in mass, and that's the mass of the shell relative to the armor, because at the end of the day, no matter what you fire at a tank, at least if you're talking about a tank v tank engagement, not talking about like big artillery rounds and so forth, but if a 120mm-ish gun fires a shell at a tank, you can pretty much guarantee that the mass of armor that shell is going to strike is going to be significantly greater than the mass of the shell. Whereas if you look at, like something like this sheet of armor, the mass of a piece of battleship armor versus the mass of the incoming battleship shell, not only is that ratio a lot closer, but given that modern composite armor is actually relatively light, that ratio is going to get closer still. And that in and of itself poses some problems, because resistance by simple inertia is a aspect of how a battleship's armor defends against an incoming shell. And also the sheer mass of an armor-piercing battleship shell means that if you have armor that is a little bit too brittle, a little bit too hard, it may well snap. So you've probably seen on this channel or in books and so forth times when a shell impacted armor and didn't necessarily penetrate in and of itself, but either the force of the impact or the explosion of the shell broke off and shoved a plug of armor through. If you have a lighter weight but far more brittle composite, that's actually far more likely to happen, or it might even take the form of shrapnel as the entire plate disintegrates. So although using modern composite materials that are probably found in most modern tank armor could definitely be a fairly expensive way of coming up with a type of armor protection that would be far more effective in terms of protection per inch thickness than conventional face hardened steel on a battleship. One, it's not going to be quite the same ratio as modern tank armor is to the old RHA armor that you'd find on mid-Cold War tanks. And two, it would have to be a different mixture. There would have to be, because of the sheer mass and energy that's being utilized by the shell that's coming in, and because of the mass ratio of the shell versus the sheet of armor being a lot closer, and just for the sheer scale of it, for various complex reasons to do with physics, you would have to have a very different mixture, probably including a lot more ductile backing material than you'd find in modern tank armor. But if you did that, you would get a extremely effective piece of armor, probably easily 2 to 3 times, possibly more effective than old school armor, but it would cost a huge amount to implement for obvious reasons. It's so much more complex a technology. But the other thing that you would want to do is actually a smaller scale implementation of modern tech. It would be things like putting, a few inches of Kevlar up against the bulkheads, or probably ideally behind the bulkheads that are inboard of the belt armor, the splinter catching layers and so forth, because relative to steel, Kevlar is very light, and Kevlar would make a really, really good way of catching all those splinters that might come inboard from armor that's been heavily hit but not failed, or has partially failed, or where the shell has broken up immediately afterwards. So that splinter proofing the deep internals of the ship would actually be much improved using modern tech, even if you actually didn't do anything to the outer belt armor at all. Unersprechlicher Benutzermen asks, could the Imperial Japanese Navy have effectively curtailed Ulithi's use as a forward staging area and, more importantly, a rest and repair stop? Perhaps a submarine blockade of incoming tankers, Yamato lobbing 18-inch shells into the atoll, or launching a carrier raid on the various dry docks, or special forces operations to blow up the ice cream barge or something. Theoretically, yes, it's possible. Practically speaking, though, by the time that the US Navy occupied Ulithi and began using it as a forward base, the Japanese Navy had been so badly beaten over the head repeatedly, they just didn't have the strength left to do anything much about it. Now, that's not to say they didn't try. There were various airstrikes attempted. There were various undersea attacks also attempted, and in some cases, on both sides of that matter, they succeeded. Airstrikes from various forms of launch, whether that be from submarines or from land bases, they didn't really have that many operational carriers left at that point, did make it through and do some damage. For example, one of the Cimarron class tankers, for example, was actually sunk within Ulithi by a Kai-10 suicide torpedo, and in fact, Ulithi was probably one of the few areas where the Kai-10 was actually viable due to its hilariously slow speed compared to a normal torpedo. Well, at that point, if a ship's at anchor and it's not going anywhere, it should be somewhat easy to hit, and Ulithi was usually so heavily crowded that even if you missed the target you were supposed to be going for, you could probably find something else. But the problem was, these kinds of things are also fairly obvious to the US Navy, so Ulithi has anti-submarine patrols, which obviously are not perfect, but if you try to do a prolonged blockade of incoming supply ships, the US Navy has more than enough destroyers and destroyer escorts and escort carriers and the occasional land-based aircraft as well to absolutely sanitize the area of you if you hang around. So that's kind of a little bit out of play. Sending Yamato or Musashi in to bombard it, well, that's Operation Tengo slightly early. Um, by the time Ulithi has been captured, there really aren't that many Japanese carriers left. Special Forces operations, kind of like the Kai-10, yes, you could try it, but while you might succeed, you're probably going to lose half a dozen subs in the attempt for every one that potentially gets through. And one sub, no matter how many Kai-10 or limpet mines, etc., it's carrying, is not going to put enough of a dent in Ulithi's capacity to stop the Americans using it. About the only way I could see that perhaps would at least cripple Ulithi for a time would be to adapt the plans that the Japanese were using before the Unryu class. So, well, Unryu herself, remember, she was sunk while transporting a whole bunch of stuff, including a whole load of those Cherry Blossom suicide missiles, to a forward staging area. In theory, if you, because you're not getting them back and you're probably not getting the ship back either, but in theory, if you strapped a bunch of very basic takeoff trolleys, disposable ones, kind of like what you got on the ME-163, and a bunch of Rato packs, you could, in theory, just line up a whole ton of Cherry Blossom missiles on the flight deck of an Unryu, because that's the only carrier that really got left at that stage, with a bunch more in the hangar ready to go. And if somehow you could sneak that vaguely close to Ulithi and then dash in at high speed overnight to within range of a Cherry Blossom, you might then be able to just start volley firing them a bit like MLRS rounds at Ulithi. And at that point, if you launch a whole salvo and run, you're just going to die running. So you might as well just stay there, keep closing, keep salvoing, keep launching, keep bringing more up from the hangar until you get blown up, because let's face it, that's going to happen to you anyway. But at that point, if you could get 100, 150 Cherry Blossoms off, given that the vast majority of ships there are going to be anchored, you might at that stage hit enough targets in the form of obviously dry docks, repair facilities, carriers, etc., to at least temporarily put the place out of action. But of course, that's relying in the first place on your carrier actually getting that close, which is not really guaranteed. Vicky asks, why did the Imperial Japanese Navy in the 1930s and 40s find the use of compressed oxygen as an oxidizer for high-speed underwater engines an easier engineering problem than the use of high-test peroxide for the same purpose, while for the Kriegsmarine it was the other way around? I think by the late 1930s and then obviously going into World War II, what you're looking at is what is the institutional knowledge base of each navy. Because for the Japanese, to a certain degree inspired by the enriched oxygen mix used in the 24.5-inch torpedoes you find on Nelson and Rodney, the Japanese have been working on the idea of an oxygen-propelled torpedo or propulsion system in general for quite a while, since the mid to late 1920s and then through the 30s. And so by the time you get to the mid 30s, late 30s, early 40s, they've made most of the mistakes that it's possible to make. And trust me, they did make a few. There were some fairly spectacular disasters in the early testing and experimental phases of their oxygen-propelled torpedo program. But it meant that by, as we said, the immediate run-up to World War II, they've essentially got a mostly mature technology on their hands, whereas they haven't really done all that much experiment with high-test peroxide. And so if you're trying, as Japan, with limited resources, to engage in a high-test peroxide test program in the middle of World War II at rush, you're probably not going to get very far before something goes horribly and dramatically wrong. which is pretty much what happened to them. Whereas for the Kriegsmarine, as you say, it was pretty much the other way around, because they had the experience of Walter, who had been looking at this in his own, essentially on his own time, not in a military role, in a civilian role, for some time, and then they'd worked further on the system as a military project. So again, although they never actually put one into service, it was much closer to a mature technology amongst the Kriegsmarine than pure oxygen power, because they looked at that after Walter had shown up, and again they would have been starting from scratch. So again, the Germans would have found themselves in a time of war in roughly the same position the Japanese would have found themselves in the late 20s and early 30s, and just flipped the two substances around for the Japanese. If you want to take a rough, approximate analogy from the modern day, you could look at air combat, where take stealth and ramjet-powered air-to-air missiles, where Europe can build a stealth aircraft, but they're somewhat behind actually doing so compared to the Americans, because the Americans started building proper stealth aircraft long before the European manufacturers thought about it, and so the Americans have a mature embedded technological advantage there. Conversely, with missiles like Meteor, and to a certain extent a few earlier ones as well, European missile manufacturers have a lot more experience in getting an actual in-service ramjet-powered air-to-air missile, which has a number of advantages over pure rocket propulsion, which is what most conventional air-to-air missiles use. And now the US is looking at building some of their own, but they're playing catch-up in that field. So both parties are highly technologically advanced. Both parties are capable of building both ramjet-powered missiles and stealth aircraft, but each party has an advantage over the other in one of those fields because they started out first. Warrant Officer Will asks, you mentioned in this video, that being the British Pacific Fleet video, that Jellicoe seemed to be aware of Japan's 8-8 plan, going way back a ways. Would Japan have considered this a breach of security, or was the 8-8 plan a relatively public secret? It wasn't really all that much of a secret, because you've got to remember the original 8-8 plan, the idea of having 8 battleships and 8 armoured cruisers that would later evolve into 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers, was official Japanese policy all the way back from the late 1900s. So there was a period of over a decade where you had the Anglo-Japanese Naval Alliance, and the 8-8 program was part of Japanese policy, so of course that would have been known and discussed between the Allies. The other fact is, of course, that the 8-8 plan in and of itself, the general guiding principles of it, were publicly debated in the Japanese equivalent of Parliament, the Diet or Diet. I'm never quite sure how that's supposed to be pronounced. But anyway, the Japanese government openly debated, should we fund it? Should we have it this level? If we are going to have it this level, how much is it going to cost, etc. So all that was publicly available information. What was secret, of course, to a certain degree, was exactly what kind of ships you were going to build to further that plan. Although, again, for someone like Jellicoe, given that big chunk of the Japanese capital ship construction in the 1910s was either done in British yards or with the assistance of British yards, if there was anyone who was going to know either exactly or very accurately what the specifications of the latest Japanese warships were, even before they went into Japanese service, it was going to be the British. Of course, as time went on and you get ships like the Nagato and so forth that are being designed and built wholly in Japan, that level of information will drop off somewhat, but the British knew exactly what the Congo class were capable of, for rather obvious reasons. So yeah, it's not really a breach of security that Britain understands that Japan has an 8-8 plan and roughly what its capabilities are at the time that Jellicoe writes up his report at the end of the 1910s and early 1920s. Going forward, of course, the public debate around exactly how many ships Japan should have and how much money they're allocating to it, that information will still be available, but exactly how capable things like the Tosas and the Amagis, etc., would be dependent entirely on how much information the Japanese are then willing to let out and what can be surmised from things like port visits and so forth. But obviously, that's going to be a lot less than what the British would have understood about the plan in the 1910s. Dynasty asks, along Roxas Boulevard in the Philippines, there's a mock-up of a turret that looks like a replica coastal battery turret. What is the turret really a replica of, and if the guns were still live and fired at their set angle, how far into Manilla Bay would the shots land? Well, this took a little bit of sleuthing to find, as it turns out that this thing has only recently been built and therefore doesn't actually show up on almost all entries on Google Maps and Google Street View, because most of their information for this area of the Philippines is from the mid 2010s, predating this. However, I was able to find a couple of photos of the thing in situ and then track back from some of the buildings in the background to its exact location. And, well, here it is. Now, this is supposed to be an approximate, and I stress approximate, replica of one of the turrets that you'd find at Fort Drum, which obviously isn't that far away. But the guns are 12-inch M1895 guns taken from some of the batteries at Corregidor. Now, I don't have the range tables for those army guns easily to hand. However, looking at what range information is available for them, and then cross-correlating that with other guns that have similar data points, i.e. roughly capable of around 12,000 yards at 15 degrees of elevation, and taking into account that these guns are elevated at about 10 degrees, I'm going to put a rough estimate, again approximating and aggregating across a number of other guns with similar range performance at 15 degrees elevation, that at 10 degrees these guns would probably shoot about 10,000 yards, which is a little over 9 kilometers, which would mean that if they did fire in their position, the shells would land just over 9 kilometers, or about 5.7 miles out into Manilla Bay, which interestingly enough would actually mean that's roughly parallel in terms of their direction of flight and the relative position of other places with the easternmost point of the Cavite Peninsula. Ian Carr asks, was consideration given to recommissioning and deploying Italian warships, including their battleships, to the Pacific for Allied use? Surprisingly enough, yes, there was, but not necessarily from the vector that you'd expect. Because bear in mind, towards the end of World War II, the entirety of the Royal Navy was available to be sent over to the Pacific, but it was limited in large part by how much of a logistics train the Royal Navy could afford. So their latest and greatest were being sent to the Pacific, and a lot of their older stuff was being either kept at home or already decommissioned. So adding another set of ships into that logistics train really didn't fit, because, well, the British had enough different calibers of guns to worry about already without having to also truck along Italian shells for their guns. And, of course, the fact that Italian ships, primarily designed for combat in the Mediterranean, weren't necessarily going to have the world's greatest range. There was another problem as well, which, of course, was that the vast majority of the Regia Marina had been inactive for several years by this point, and so they would need a reasonable time to refit and get themselves ready for sea again. However, with all that said, you've got to bear in mind that when Italy bowed out of the war in 1943, it was under an armistice, and the final treaty with Italy wasn't actually, believe it or not, concluded until 1947. So during that period, the officially recognised Italian government was in favour with the Allies, but trying to work out how to get a better final peace deal at the end of things. And so they came up with this grand idea in early summer 1945 of declaring war on Japan and actually volunteering the entirety of all remaining operational Regia Marina forces. So that would be the 2 surviving Littorios, I think about just over half a dozen cruisers, a mixture of heavy and light, plus just under a dozen destroyers, around about a dozen subs. So not a bad force, all things considered. But they essentially said, look, this is every operational leisure mariner unit we have. We are prepared to send this over to the Pacific to support your war efforts. But the Allies, again, for pretty much for logistical reasons, didn't seem to be all that interested. If pretty much if the British were struggling to support their own forces, that would mean that the Italians would have to show up with their own ships. Because if the Americans, okay, yeah, they'd share fuel with the British, but they weren't going to share all that much else, but thanks to Admiral King's insistence. And Britain and America had been allies for a good chunk of the war. Yeah, the Americans are not going to carve out a special niche portion of their fleet just to service the Italian ships. And on top of that, even though they made the offer, the Italian government also knew that it was going to take quite a while, not just to bring the ships back up to operational conditions, but also to train them and fit them with equipment so they could communicate with the Allies, so they could integrate with the Allies, putting things like radar in to better direct their gunfire because of kamikazes. So they were looking at a arrive off the Japanese coast date of late 1946 or so, even if the Allies had accepted the offer, which of course they didn't. And of course World War II was over for a year and a bit by the time they could even in theory have gotten there. Michael Insk asks, if the British had not pulled ships out of the Pacific at the start of World War II, how do you think it would have impacted Japan's offensive? Given that most of the British carriers would have been elsewhere, wouldn't more British ships present just mean more being sunk by Japanese air power, whether it was carrier or land-based? Well, it very much depends on what the British choose to keep there. Now, bearing in mind that the British had already drawn down what was at the time known as the China Station forces by the time World War II broke out, because they'd been marshalling the fleet all the way back in the UK. But even so, in September 1939, they had a fair number of submarines present, that being 15 submarines of the 4th Submarine Flotilla, including some of their big ones, including a number of mine layers. Then there were some sloops, there was a small motor torpedo boat flotilla, a few older destroyers for defending Singapore, the Monitor, HMS Terror, a whole bunch of gunboats and minesweepers, probably not really all that important. There was also the 21st Destroyer Flotilla, mostly of D-class destroyers. The Eagle, the aircraft carrier, although that left when World War II broke out, September the 3rd. And the 5th Cruiser Squadron, which was Kent, Cornwall, and Dorsetshire, so all county-class heavy cruisers, and the light cruiser Birmingham. So of those, would Eagle have made a huge amount of difference? Not really. If Eagle was still there, the Japanese have more than enough air strength in the Kido Butai to deal with it. 5th Cruiser Squadron, potentially a bit more of a thorn in the Japanese side, but even though 3 counties and a town are not anything to sniff at, the Japanese historically deployed the Congos to their sort of Southeast Asia operations, and that's more than enough. Plus, they have various heavy cruisers and so forth. Now, yeah, granted, 3 counties and a town probably could have ambushed and taken out 1 or more Japanese invasion convoys, but if they'd been around, the Japanese would have ensured they had heavier escorts in the area. So, surface ships probably not really going to make all that much difference. Probably best either kept at Singapore, waiting for reinforcements like Force Z, or dropping back further still. But yeah, those 15 submarines, those could have made a big difference. I mean, you look at the number of casualties the Dutch submarines inflicted, and the Dutch had fewer submarines, and a lot of them were in the process of breaking down relatively rapidly, and they still did a fair bit of damage. 15 pretty intact, well-maintained submarines with a depot ship not having to bounce back and forth between a half dozen different occupied ports as they fall one by one to the Japanese, and with some of those mine-laying subs. Yeah, that could have put a serious crimp on Japanese efforts to head south, and no matter how strong they have a surface fleet, As we know, the Japanese are not very good at anti-submarine warfare, and they're especially not very good at anti-submarine warfare at the beginning of their involvement in the Second World War. And it's a double effect there as well, because not only is the loss of shipping bad for the Japanese, but every big troop ship or merchantman that's carrying a bunch of troops in an invasion convoy that goes down is not only depriving the Japanese of troops for that particular invasion and the supplies that go with the ships as well, it's also depriving the Japanese of transportation capability to get more replacement troops in, and it means the Japanese don't have access to those troops for future operations either. So it could put a big dent in Japanese plans for the Southeast Pacific, to the point that it could slow their invasion down possibly quite considerably if the right convoys are hit at the right times. And if the British do manage to preserve their surface ships, either by keeping them at Singapore or falling back to somewhere like Ceylon, then, okay, Eagle's not the fastest ship in the world, and she's not the world's most capable carrier either, but as we've discussed many times when it comes to Force Z, just load her up with a bunch of fighters, and, even full Mars will do a reasonably decent job of keeping Force Z safe against what forces the Japanese could bring to bear at them at the time. Jeff asks, if the British Pacific Fleet had been created 12 to 18 months earlier, do you think it might have done more than just support US efforts, like, say, going after Singapore or Hong Kong? Not really, for two primary reasons. One, the logistics of the fleet train just weren't there to support something like a mass troop movement or invasion that early on in, well, it's late in the World War II, but early on in the British serious efforts in the Pacific. And secondly, there kind of already was a British Pacific fleet in the sort of year or so leading up to the formation of the actual British Pacific Fleet, and that was the Eastern Fleet. So various ships were out there. Queen Elizabeth was out there, Valiant was out there. So this photo is taken from Queen Elizabeth looking at Valiant, and in the background, yes, that is Richelieu. A whole bunch of Allied warships were out there forming the Eastern Fleet, and they did actually undertake some raids on the westernmost portions of Japanese-held territory, but they were limited by not having a huge amount of carrier air power, and as I said, they didn't have a big enough logistics train to spend huge amounts of time at sea well away from base. So they could go out, they had some logistics, so they could go out, they could shoot up the nearest Japanese targets, hang around for a bit, refuel a bit, and then go home. But they couldn't do the kind of thing that the British Pacific Fleet could do later on. And so that was kind of about as good as the British, and of course with the French and so forth, their allies, could do at the time. If they'd tried to form something a bit more long range, well, it's got to happen after Tirpitz has been destroyed, because that's holding up a reasonable amount of Allied naval power in the North Atlantic and North Sea regions. And then you've got the need to refit everything for tropical conditions. And of course, in late 43, you still got Scharnhorst popping around, as well as Tirpitz, but even early 44, after Scharnhorst has gone down, you've still got the whole D-Day operations, invasion of Europe to cope with. Diverting large amounts of troops from that, probably not really going to be an easy sell to the British public. So I think the Eastern Fleet probably was about as far as you were likely to get at that stage. Sharkman asks, why did the US restrict the British from attacking Japanese capital ships? Was it a practical reason, or was it a matter of glory? It was mostly a sort of a glory propaganda, public relations thing. The US at that point, even by the latter stages of World War II, was still really, really hopping mad about Pearl Harbor. And they had got this notion into their heads that every single Japanese ship that was even tangentially related to Pearl Harbor, and of course a lot of the Japanese capital ships were related to that in some way, shape or form, and some of them had directly escorted the WWII, would be destroyed and would be destroyed by American hands. Now, of course, Nagato actually survived, but details. But they really, really wanted those scalps, and they wanted them for themselves. So essentially, they told the British, yeah, back off. This is personal. These things are ours. Even things like Yamato and Musashi that couldn't physically have been involved in the Pearl Harbor attacks on account of not actually being fully in service by that point in time. There was also, however, there's also the general PR element of, hey, we've been fighting this war in the Pacific as the sort of the main element of the Allied effort here for years. Stop kill stealing the glory, the really nice kills. But there was also a slightly more practical side of it, which was that by the time the British showed up, the vast majority of remaining Japanese capital ships were confined in pretty much to the home islands and the immediate waters around that. And where the Americans wanted the British to operate, regardless of who you were, obviously people like MacArthur and King would prefer the British were off in a side theatre. Spruance, Nimitz, and Halsey were quite happy to have them as part of the front line, but on one of the flanks, which is obviously where they ended up. But those were not the areas where Japanese capital ships were likely to appear. So for the British to make any kind of particular effort to go after the capital ships, if Japanese capital ships came to them, that was another matter. But otherwise, for the British to go after Japanese capital ships, it would imply that the British forces were operating as an integral part of the central frontline task force, the fast carrier task force, which the Americans didn't particularly want. So again, it was a case of no, we'll deal with those. Keep off. Nathapron Hong Sharon asks, what naval engineering disasters other than poorly designed ships do you think are interesting? I really love engineering disaster stories, mostly because I decided to be a programmer despite having an engineering degree and not having to deal with such disasters. Well, to be honest, most naval engineering disasters are due to poorly designed ships, because that's a major part of naval engineering. But in terms of naval disasters which can in large part either be explained or examined under the auspices of naval engineering, some of my favourites, for a given value thereof, would include things like the sinking of HMS Victoria by HMS Camperdown. The mechanics of the whole ramming sequence is quite interesting. Then you've got the escape of HMS Calypso during the Apia hurricane in Samoa. That's hugely interesting from a perspective of both the ships that went aground, the German and American ships, but also the absolute amount of redundancy that was built into the Calypso. And even then, given she's a Victorian engineered ship, even then, how close she came to actually going down with the rest of the ships. It's an absolutely fascinating story and something I have to do a Wednesday video on at some point. And I think as a more general one, I'm usually quite interested in seeing what happens to ships that flood and sink gradually from torpedo or mine strikes. Because some things like HMS Barham, it's fairly obvious you get hit by that many torpedoes in quick succession. We're talking obviously submarine launched 21-inch weapons. It's not exactly shocking that she rolls over and explodes and sinks. But then you have things like HMS Audacious in World War One, taking a mine hit and obviously going over and sinking. But then you have other ships that are similarly mined or torpedoed, and some of them sink and some of them don't, even though they're all, well, the ones that I'm talking about are roughly, torpedoed or mined roughly in the midships 50% of the ship, because a bow or stern hit, it's understandable why the ship wouldn't sink at that point. But I do find it intriguing to look at ships that sunk or didn't sink because of those strikes in the effectively citadel area, and what differentiates them, because sometimes the ships are otherwise, broadly speaking, very similar in terms of role, are they battleship, cruiser, carrier, whatever, and approximate build period. So what exactly internally in engineering terms, made it that one ship sank relatively easily and another ship didn't. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, if it had been decided to create a branch of the National Maritime Museum at what is now the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard in the vein of FDR's National Naval Museum in the course of the war, so presumably this would be World War I, World War II, what ships would you put in it? You have access to 1 quaysides, number 1 Basin and number 1 through 6 docks. Victory is already in situ. Okay, so this is World War II. And it would be best practice to leave 1 dock for future ships, like, let's say, Mary Rose. What would you like to have seen in such a museum? Bearing in mind, of course, these are all small docks. Okay, so here's Portsmouth Dockyard generally, at least as it was a little while back, and we're just going to zoom in on the section that's been indicated, and obviously this is essentially the northern end of Portsmouth Historic Dockyard as it is now. So these days, Dock 1 is taken up by the Monitor M33, Dock 2 by HMS Victory, Dock 3 by the Mary Rose, Docks 4, 5 and 6, as well as the quaysides, are still in Royal Navy hands. Now, I don't have to worry about HMS Warrior because she's off further south, well, or will be eventually because this is post-World War II. So in terms of the quayside, which is obviously the bit just to the left, that much I think there's a fairly easy candidate. The obvious one is HMS Warspite, but if I can't get her, because the Navy says either you can't have her or she's in too much need of repair to be a viable museum ship, then my fallback options in order would be HMS Renown, battle cruiser, or HMS Rodney. Of the three, if it's down to the Navy saying, well, we don't think you can maintain this ship because it's got too many maintenance issues in the short term, i.e. I get the ship that's most in the best shape, then I'd probably get Renown, which, okay, it's not Warspite, but, I'd settle for having HMS Renown there at the quayside, and that's my big ship investment. Now, obviously, I don't have M33 at this point in dock number 1, and I'm going to assume that I don't know that that's coming. So I have to think of candidates for docks 1, 4, 5, and 6, bearing in mind we're keeping dock 3 in free for our theoretical future Mary Rose. So that means that, roughly speaking, I've got about 225 foot, give or take, to play with in dock 1, 260 foot in dock 4, 230 foot in dock 5, but Dock 6 is an interesting one because it's the smallest in and of itself. You probably only get about 190 foot ship in there. However, nowadays, that area of approach to Dock 6 has been built over. It's part of the quayside that supports the Queen Elizabeth class carriers now. And so, theoretically, there would be scope to have a larger ship fitting into Dock 6 and then sticking out into the area where you can see it's labelled gates at the moment, and still allow the Navy to build past that to form their more modern quayside, and that would give me a potentially up to 300 feet. Now, the problem is, for World War II era ships, there's actually precious little you could fit in there. All the destroyers, some of the submarines, even the monitors of the Abdiel class, all smaller ships that I would like to preserve, are still all too big. But after some thinking and taking in mind the dimensions of the exact dry docks each, I have come up with a short list of ships to save. So in dock number 1, adjacent to HMS Victory, in fact pointing at it, would be HMS Implacable, aka Duguay Troyen, aka the only third rate that would ever be preserved at that point, because it was the only third rate left, 2-decker, French built, actually at the Battle of Trafalgar on the French side, captured thereafter, for some bizarre and stupid reason, scuttled after World War II, but I'd put her there in dock number 1, adjacent to Victory. Using my expand dock 6 exploit, I would install there HMS Starling, Johnny Walker's flagship, modified Black Swan class sloop. She's just a fraction under 300 foot long, so she can fit as long as we build over past the jetty, so she'd be permanently stuck in there, but hey, that's just life. And for docks 4 and 5, it's again very difficult to actually find something small enough to fit, but in the end I discovered that you could probably just about fit an S-class destroyer from World War I in dock number 4, and there were a few still in service in 1945, so I think that would be a good shout, because that is therefore covering the destroyer force in general, and also covering both World Wars One and Two. Plus, I think Admiral Cunningham might like that because he was quite fond of the S-class when he served in them in the latter stages of the 1910s. And then in the slightly smaller dock number 5, I would fit either an S-class or a U-class submarine, because either class can fit, and that's a good commemoration of the World War II era Royal Navy submarines. And honestly, I would have preferred to put a T-class in, but the only place a T-class would have fitted would have been using my little cheat up at dock number 6, and I really, really want Starling. So those would be my choices. Let me know what yours would be. Joao Rita asks, lost naval moments from the early 19th century up to the end of World War II. What are 2 to 4 moments in naval history, either generic or specific events, where great wins or disasters could have happened if one thing had happened slightly differently? Well, of course, there's the good old reliable what happens if either the Admiralty actually sends all its information or Jellicoe decides, for reasons, to believe the Admiralty when they say where the High Seas Fleet is going overnight after having received a lot of dodgy intelligence. But there you go. So, Grand Fleet awaits the High Seas Fleet on the morning after Jutland, and, well, the High Seas Fleet probably isn't in for a very good time. Another one would be, what happens if Admiral Nagumo, instead of deciding to rearm all of his aircraft when he hears that the US carriers are out there, what if he takes Yamaguchi's suggestion and just launches what he has? Yeah, it's not ideal, but it's better than what we know actually happened for him. So, I mean, it's not going to really save the Japanese carriers that much from being hit by the US aircraft, although if they have most of their aircraft in the air, then their hangar decks are not packed with fueled and armed aircraft, so perhaps the fires aboard the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu are not as bad. But even if they are as bad, and or the damage in some other way leads to the loss of the ships, if their majority of their air group is actually inbound and hits Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, or some variation thereof, and the Battle of Midway ends up being more of a score draw, that could affect huge swathes of the Pacific War, because obviously you need those carriers for the Guadalcanal campaign. Obviously you won't have Yorktown anyway, but think about what Enterprise and Hornet accomplished at the Battle of Eastern Solomons, Battle of Santa Cruz, and in Enterprise's case thereafter. The whole of late 1942 could change. Or one of my perennial favourites, what if the aircraft that was carrying replacements for the Admiral and Governor of Dakar, who Darlan and the Vichy French forces feared might defect along with the battleship Richelieu to the Allies, what if that aircraft carrying their replacements crashed or randomly disappeared, perhaps in conjunction with a failure of radio communication? So that leaves a pro-Free French senior staff present in Dakar when the British show up. It's entirely possible at that point to construct a scenario where the battleship Richelieu comes under Free French and British control in July 1940. And given that it took 8 to 9 months to patch up Richelieu and get her fully operational in the States, after she'd historically been inactive for quite a while and taken damage from various attacks and had a couple of her own guns explode on her, it's very, very plausible to suggest that if she'd been taken from Dakar undamaged immediately for completion in the US, and bearing in mind this would be mid-1940, so the US isn't at war, so if the British say, hey, we've got this battleship we'd like you to modernise or repair, I guess, because Richelieu is pretty modern, complete would be the best term, there's no reason for the US not to do it, especially if they're getting paid. They were quite happy to do it with other British Royal Navy ships at the time, at which point Richelieu could easily have been in service with the Free French Navy in the very start of 1941, at which point it makes perfectly logical sense for her to be stationed with the home fleet, which of course means that when Bismarck breaks out later on in May 1941, it's almost certainly going to be Richelieu alongside Prince of Wales and possibly Hood, who get dispatched to intercept Bismarck. And if I was in any way, shape or form going to be in charge, or someone sensible was going to be in charge, and let's face it, most of the admirals would be, you definitely put Richelieu in the front. She can fire all her guns forward. She's a modern ship, and unlike Prince of Wales, a worked up ship, so it makes perfect sense to lead the attack. And I'm pretty sure Richelieu would have cleaned Bismarck's clock pretty happily, especially if she had Prince of Wales and possibly even Hood as backup. Greg Germain asks, during World War II, when a Pacific island was bypassed, how many assets were used to maintain that island's isolation? What has to be invested to keep an island from resupply and or allowing the Japanese to remove the soldiers? Were bypass locations constantly monitored or just occasionally checked? It varied quite considerably depending on the island and the time period. So, for example, if we take Wake Island, which you can see here being subject to a US bombing raid at one point, initially Wake Island is subjected to a submarine blockade because it's still relatively close to the front line. But as the front line continued to advance, although it was also initially subject to both B-24 bombing raids and carrier strikes, it gradually became less and less of a focus, with the US using more intel because obviously they had cracked a lot of Japanese codes, to determine, well, was anything being sent there? If not, well, there wasn't much point in having a bunch of submarines sitting uselessly off the island. If there was something sent there, it was better to deal with it close to the Japanese home islands as part of the general submarine campaign. But, as I've remarked before, Wake Island was then used as the occasional live fire testing range for aircraft carriers that were heading out to the frontline Pacific area, because it would offer some resistance, but it was a known quantity of resistance, and therefore carriers that had perhaps inexperienced air groups could work themselves up in some live fire testing that didn't necessarily involve massively overwhelming odds against them. And then, of course, it also depends on how large the base is. So somewhere like Truk Lagoon, that needed a little bit more watching and, active submarine patrols and so forth for a lot longer than Wake Island did, as well as occasional airstrikes to suppress Japanese attempts at significantly recovering their airfield capacity. Then we have, in 1919, RMS Olympic had her coal-fired boilers replaced with oil-fired ones. With regard to warships, was this possible? Were engines ever replaced, and what was involved in replacing the boilers? How much of a ship could be unbolted to gain access, remove and install components and so forth, and how much would have to be cut? And how much was this done, and if not much, why not? Yes, it was possible. So, for example, the Congo class originally burned mostly coal with some oil spraying, and when they were modernized, they were converted to purely oil burning. And this happened a few times with various ships. Italian modernizations of their dreadnoughts, for example. Some US ships would have significant portions of their machinery replaced in the 1920s. USS Texas actually is a famous example that's still around, originally built as a coal burner and then completely reboilered as an oil burner. The problem is that it's not very often done. It's only really done if it's absolutely necessary, either as part of a modernization or because a whole system of machinery like coal firing has gone out of use and the ship is still needed and is big enough and expensive enough to merit the issue. Essentially, the problem is when you look at the way ships are built, especially capital ships, they have their engines and, well, the boilers as well, installed during the build process while the ship is only partially complete from a hull perspective. And then other stuff is built on top of it, including the armor deck. And unless you're looking at some very specific ships, like some US Navy ships, for example, with turboelectric drives, which actually were designed to be able to lift out sections of the armor deck to replace components, most of the time it was assumed that outside of catastrophic damage or failure, you weren't going to need to replace the entire boiler's machinery, for example. You might need to replace parts, but parts could be brought down via hatches and so forth, or perhaps small unbolted sections. But entire sections of the machinery plant as a whole, that wasn't thought to be necessary because most machinery, as I've said before, had usually a 20 to 25-year lifespan, depending on its projected usage. And it wasn't generally anticipated that a ship would be in service for that long or longer. And yes, a lot of ironclads did make it well past that period, but most of their career past the kind of machinery lifetime expired section was spent in reserve or as training ships or and so forth, or perhaps they'd gone into reserve before they'd reached that machinery lifetime expired point. So what this was all working up to is that if you want to do something like that, you essentially have to strip off a good chunk of the superstructure, which is above the boilers. Then you have to take apart a whole load of decks, and you have to cut through, usually, the armor deck, and then eventually you will have access to the boilers. So it's a huge job, and hence why I say, unless something catastrophic has happened, it's not something you really want to do. That's why a number of ships that suffered catastrophic boiler incidents, it was actually judged better to retire them rather than try and fix the issue because of the cost and effort that would be involved in so doing. So again, outside of some of the US ships in the 20s when they're switching from coal to oil, the vast majority of the time that you see this done is done when the ship's been completely thoroughly modernized and overhauled anyway, so you're essentially stripping the ship down to bare bones. And the reason the picture in question has been up all this time is that this, believe it or not, is HMS Warspite, and it's not while she's initially under construction. This is what she's like part way through her reconstruction and modernization in the 1930s. So this doesn't even represent sort of the lowest, if you like, that she got to. This is on her way back up to being the ship we'd know in World War II. And it illustrates, I think, just how much of a ship was torn down during these modernizations. You're essentially ripping out most of what you would recognize as the ship down to almost, not quite, but almost the hull frames and the plating. Stéphane Pirot asks, my question is about the French Océan class first-rate Orient or Dauphin Royal. Would you happen to know what the figurehead was on this ship? Well, I'm at a little bit of a loss. I did a fair bit of digging around for this question. There seem to be some modern interpretations that would suggest perhaps a topless angel or a topless winged woman at the very least with a trumpet. But there doesn't seem to be anything other than, oh, this is the figurehead for L'Orient-Dauphin Royal to back that up. The only period reference I could find is a bone model of L'Orient, which was made by prisoners after the Battle of the Nile. Quite a lot of these things were made in that time period, and to fairly high detail. It's fully labelled as L'Orient, it has provenance, and in that, the figurehead is actually carved, and it appears to show a young man kind of stepping forward with his right arm raised, which would make sense given that she was originally named Dauphin Royal, and she was launched and in the water before she was renamed Sans-Culotte and then L'Orient. So, presumably at that point, the figurehead would be of the Dauphin Royal, the heir to the French throne. And therefore, if I was going to go with anything, I would say that would probably be the more accurate indication because, you know, as I said, these are French prisoners from the Battle of the Nile. They're making a model of the flagship at the Battle of the Nile. If anybody's going to know what the figurehead looked like, it would be them. And since they have all the time and freedom in the world to carve that figurehead, it only really makes sense that they would carve something that was appropriate to what the ship had been. Sorry I can't be of much more help than that, but I suspect that the answer, if it lies anywhere, may well be in a French language source. And finally, for this week, Alex Moskovitz asks, what were the barriers for replacing stokers with some sort of mechanical coal handling system? Did anyone try to implement an automated system for feeding coal to the boilers? And if you took a stoker from the first coal-powered ships and put them on the last generation of coal-powered ships, would they need any additional training? Well, with regards to that last bit, not particularly. I mean, it's coal shoveling. The scale of it might have changed, but the fundamentals of take coal from bunker, transport coal to boiler, shovel coal into boiler, it's all pretty much of a muchness. In terms of mechanical or automated coal feeding systems on battleships, as opposed to something that's on a relatively small scale like steam locomotives, the fundamental problem is complexity and size. Because, yes, on a steam locomotive where you have a coal tender, or perhaps two, having some kind of feeder system that just works off the bottom of that and feeds coal into the furnace is perfectly doable. For a warship, however, it's got to be very extensively throttleable, because you might have coal that you want to feed in just to keep things ticking over. You might have coal that you want to feed in to keep the ship at cruising speed. You might have coal that you want to feed in to get the ship at maximum speed. And the sheer volume of coal that is involved at that point is going to be very large. Then, as you've got complexity, because you've got not just can we get a mechanical system that is taking coal to the boiler, you've got lots of boilers and lots of bunkers in different areas of the ship, and those bunkers are of different sizes and different positions relative to the boilers. So you're going to have to invent some kind of labyrinthine system with varying degrees of capacity, because it's got to be able to, bear in mind, it's got to be able at maximum to extract the maximum amount of coal you need, but it's got to extract coal from every single bunker, which means that its extraction point is either going to have to be manually manned, so people are still going to have to be in those bunkers shoveling coal onto the system, or the system's going to have to be able to extend and elevate and to press and rove left and right, etc., to collect the coal in the bunkers, because those bunkers are pretty darn big. And then it's got to move that coal onto presumably a larger conveyor belt system of some description, which is also moving coal from other bunkers. And then when it gets to the boiler room or boiler rooms, it's got to split that coal either between multiple boiler rooms, or even if it's a single boiler room, it's got to somehow split that coal evenly between multiple boilers. And you've got to have a system where you can shut off the feed of coal to certain boilers, or open up that feed depending on how many boilers you've got running at any given time. It would be such a hugely complicated system. It would end up weighing more and needing than the stoker system, and you'd need a lot of people just to maintain the thing. And that brings us to the end of the dry dock for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope to see you again in another video soon.